for all the match strikers.
This is Spiritual Pyro.
Hi and welcome. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Corinne.
We've spent 3 years writing a book that was set to release last year.
And then it didn't.
And then we went dark.
And didn't tell you why.
Until now.
But first we need to catch you up on a little bit of the backstory.
Yeah, we should probably tell you what happened. Just so you know, we've taken our time writing this first episode. There are parts of our story we've shared before, and parts we're sharing for the very first time.
Some of what we share might feel heavy. You might even hear our voices shake. That's okay. It all belongs.
So meet us back here at the end of the episode. We're so glad you're with us.
Grab a blanket and pull up around the fire. Welcome to Spiritual Pyro.
You are about to hear the personal experience of Sarah Carter, wife of Steve, the former lead teaching pastor of Willow Creek Community Church in Illinois, told by her in her own words. At the time of Steve's service, more than 25,000 congregants gathered at Willow Creek each weekend to worship. In 2018, multiple women came forward to assert that the founding pastor of Willow Creek had been engaging in sexual misconduct for decades. The fallout of this hit many lives, including Sarah's. Until now, she has not shared the details of what transpired in her heart, mind, and home during those dark days. Today, she breaks that silence in this step toward reclamation by sharing her story with you now.
Okay, so it was 2012. We were living in Southern California. I was working as an artist at a gallery, and Steve was a campus pastor at the local church. Emerson was 4, and I was pregnant with Mercy. That year, Steve was offered a director of evangelism and teacher-at-large position at a megachurch in the Midwest. The possibility of a new role, the chance to develop, lead, and the exposure to global partnerships came at the perfect time for our family, and we jumped at the opportunity. Internally, my belief system was already evolving as I began to deconstruct my own faith. In some ways, my deconstruction had already begun. In many ways, I was not yet fully accepting that my faith was shifting and was doing everything I could to convince myself that I could continue to sort of ignore the looming questions and the invitations into my own spiritual deconstruction, but also just evolving faith, and that I could kind of keep powering through, keep being the good pastor's wife, and kind of keep everything running smoothly and on track. I remember when it wasn't long after we got the job offer that a friend familiar with the church called to tell me I better get myself together and commit to being a constructive member. She actually warned me not to do anything to drag down the church's good name. I answered so earnestly that, of course, I was going to give it my best shot at being positive, attending weekend services, and supporting Steve. It's actually wild how at the time that conversation didn't seem strange to me. I was so certain that I could continue being the good pastor's wife. The church was one of the original seeker-sensitive megachurches, and its ethos oozed structure, control, and power. From the ground up, it orbited around one man and his philosophy that the local church was the hope of the world. So Steve hit the ground running and began working 60-plus hours a week. While he was thriving in the strive to succeed culture of the church, I was so lonely. and struggling with a really rough pregnancy. A much more challenging beginning to the fresh start that I had hoped for. I wanted so badly to be able to be strong and supportive and to not be a problem. The pregnancy was so draining, and I really didn't have community yet. And I was struggling with loneliness, just trying to find my place amongst a new everything, new home, new neighborhood, new church, new friends, new grocery stores, new everything. And not feeling like myself was making it all the more difficult to do. I remember the senior pastor suggesting that rather than risk delivering on a weekend church service, I should schedule an inducement so that Steve could be there for the birth of our daughter. If there was any doubt about where their priorities lay, that sums it up. Nothing was more important than the church, especially those weekend services and the tens of thousands of dollars that they brought in. The shiny facade of the church was beginning to fade for me, and I felt like I was being judged by the friend who'd warned me to behave before we'd moved. I actually started to second guess myself. In many ways, I was living incongruently and had a really hard time knowing who I was. What was me, and what was me pretending? Anyway, fast forward a few years. The kids are now 4 and 9. I was still working as an artist, although I didn't have a gallery space. I was working on commission pieces for clients local and throughout the country out of a home studio. Steve was positioned to become the co lead pastor as part of the organization's succession plan. I was still struggling with trying to figure out how my faith fit in this new world, in this new church, in this new system, especially as mine was continuing to shift. In a conversation we didn't see coming, Steve's book publisher warned there were former staff members of the church coming forward with allegations of sexual misconduct against the senior pastor. That information sent me reeling. We had no idea there'd been any sort of malfeasance occurring in any capacity regarding the pastor. It wasn't long after that the Chicago Tribune published an article about an investigation they'd conducted examining allegations of inappropriate behavior by the senior pastor, along with quotes and information surrounding the women's experiences. Steve would actually come home and debrief some of his meetings. In one, the staff were told that the allegations were false attempts by the disgruntled employees to bring down the pastor ahead of his retirement. But without any reason to doubt them, many accepted this explanation. While I chose not to attend, Steve assisted the leadership team with a church-wide meeting where they shared a similar explanation with the entire 20,000 plus congregation. But my gut told me there was more to the story, and I started asking questions on my social platforms. As a result, Steve was told by the senior pastor to get control of Sarah. So I was ready to go to the mat, drop every morsel of information I had, and set the whole place on fire. I was furious that they were trying to keep me quiet. This organization that I wasn't even employed at was trying to control my personal platforms, my personal voice, information that pertained to more of the process that was going on behind the scenes, more of the elaborate attempts that were being made to try to manage the stories, to try to manage the angles, to try to manage the communication, the way that these women's experiences were perceived publicly, and to try to control the narrative. But I held back. Blowing it all up and burning it all down would have been one way to go. It sure as hell would have satisfied my rage and the indignation I felt at being muzzled. But this job put food on our table and paid our mortgage every month. It was still important to Steve, and we still had many people we cared about within the community. Internally, I was terrified of what would happen if we really tried to go up against this machine and we lost. We could lose everything. We would lose our income. We would lose our security. We would lose belonging. We could lose our reputations, our good standing, our future opportunities. So much felt like it was on the line if we were to cross them in the wrong way and really take it to where I wanted to take it to, which was to just expose the truth, to just get it out there. I was tangling with a very dangerous system, and I didn't yet know just how serious the stakes were about to become. Then more accusations came against the senior pastor, and more supporting details were published in more articles. Spaces including Chicago Tribune and Christianity Today. The church leadership hired PR firms and lawyers to help combat the growing unease amongst staff, congregants, and the public eye. My awareness of a larger global sisterhood of women was growing too. The Me Too movement was already well underway, and the Believe Women phenomenon was spreading worldwide. The juxtaposition of support for women with events like the original Women's March in downtown Chicago, which I actually marched in alongside thousands of women and supporters, was in glaring contrast to what I watched happen behind closed doors at the church where they were protecting the abuser and disbelieving the victims. We were struggling to find a path forward as I was entirely in support of the women and wanted to be so loud about it. Steve was trying to keep it all together, terrified of the implications if he allowed himself to consider that their claims of abuse were valid. This put a massive strain on our relationship. It really did. It was so hard to feel like we not necessarily were on opposite sides of the issue, but were in opposite positions as far as what to do about it. I knew that Steve was so full of integrity. I felt deeply in my heart that I was coming from a place of integrity. And the fact that we weren't in alignment just made everything we were going through that much harder. It made both of us feel that much more lonely and confused. And it made it really hard to just navigate our normal family life, to know how to function within our normal family and our normal home. How do we interact with our kids? What are the stories we're telling? What are we withholding? How do we have these really hard conversations with each other without turning on each other, without getting us either of us into a position where we felt like our backs were up against the wall? Really, how do we let each other both exist as full individuals within this dynamic of just utter devastation and disillusionment as we're watching the scandal unfold publicly on all of these platforms, but then also privately, the way that it was rippling through our own relationship, our own selves, and within our family and within other friendships as well. It was an incredibly hard impact and one that took us a really long time to navigate our way through. But there was no denying the facts, and he quietly met with many of the women who'd come forward and learned more of the context and story. Their accounts only added to the stack of evidence gathered against the senior pastor, making it impossible to ignore the blatant cover up happening in the organization. At this point, we still weren't clear on why more wasn't being done to investigate the claims and why the leadership, elders, and HR protocol had been so ineffective. After even more articles and allegations were brought forth, the church held another congregational meeting. There, the senior pastor announced his decision to retire. Yep, retire. So cute, huh? That way, he retained control of the narrative while relieving himself of public accountability. What a perfectly designed system for perpetually unchecked abuses of power. After that, Steve came home and told me he spent the day with our friend, who'd invited him to join her in a legal meeting with her lawyer, an HR staff person, an elder, a pastoral care staff person, and a lawyer representing the church. I remember I was outside in our front patio watering the flowers when Steve called me to tell me that our friend had invited him into that meeting. And I believe my friend, but I was nervous about all the other people that were going to be a part of that meeting. I didn't know what Steve would be walking into. Was this a meeting that was like a setup? It was so hard to trust anyone at this point who was affiliated with the church. And I was really nervous that he might be walking into a situation that would reflect poorly on him or that would be almost like sabotage. And I struggled to like really encourage him to do it, to go, to say yes. I know that his courage in that moment was something that I really clung to because I wasn't feeling brave. I was really starting to feel the impact of and see the ripple effects of how our being difficult, and I say that with quotes, our being difficult in the eyes of the leadership, our refusal to just go along with whatever they were saying we should go along with was already becoming problematic. And I was really, for the first time, probably coming face to face with some of the how deep this scandal ran and how elaborate it really was. And so, knowing that he was being invited into a meeting with so many lawyers and PR people and staff that at that point neither of us really trusted from the church side, and it was really because of our friend who we know and we trust and we believe that I found a way to find peace with the fact that he was going to be stepping into this meeting, into this space with these people. He had no idea what he was walking into, but agreed to go on behalf of our friend. In the meeting, he learned about a long process that had already been underway in which our friend had reported her own experiences of misconduct by the senior pastor to HR, in which she had been continuously gaslit and bypassed. My heart broke for my friend and raged at the wrongdoing she experienced. Honestly, at that point, I felt so disoriented and so dysregulated that I didn't really stop to even think about the fact that my friend had kept such horrible experiences to herself, that she had felt so afraid that she couldn't even let us in. It felt like everything was coming at us so fast, there really wasn't time to slow down and feel much. I know now, looking back, I was in full on survival mode and felt incredibly unable to really process much outside of the immediate emotion that was going to keep myself and my family the safest that we could possibly be in the midst of what felt like now looming and ongoing threats coming daily. And part of what made that so hard is that they weren't necessarily spoken threats, they were perceived and implied threats. It was more in the implied warnings that the powers that be at any moment could take away our stability, our security. And for Steve, especially, even just his responsibility and his access to his career that he had worked so hard for. We were being kept out of many other details and discussions, and if our friend hadn't invited Steve to join her that day, we likely would have had no idea the meeting had even happened. I sat on the couch as he recounted the story, my mouth open. I was absolutely devastated. For me, this was the ultimate turning point. No longer was this an issue about what happened in the past. Now it was current. Now it was ongoing. Now it was happening to my friend. Staying silent and doing nothing was no longer an option. Even then, though, we believed it was just an information issue and that once the leaders had more context, they would make an informed decision that protected the victims and held those in the wrong accountable. Can we just have a moment of silence for the ways that we hope for the best? Because it's so earnest and so trusting and so naive. At this point, Steve and I were in complete alignment in the fact that we believed the women, we believed their experiences, and that we wanted to do everything we could to show that support and to try to figure out ways to navigate this this devastating truth in a way that felt honoring and full of integrity and opportunity for there to be understanding. So together we talked about it and came to the decision that we wanted to bring our concerns to the board of elders. Steve set up the meeting with the elders, and while he was there, I stayed home and tried my best to distract myself. I was so anxious, but really I had such an expectation that this would be a path, that this would be a bridge, that he was going to come home and tell me that there was understanding and that there was clarity brought to the table, that the elders were open to finding a more honoring and authentic and honest approach to the experiences that these women shared and what next steps needed to happen as a result. He told them that he and I planned to post a statement that we had co authored on his website supporting the women. Most elders balked and doubled down on their stance of the senior pastor's innocence. They iterated the importance of Christian unity and warned him that speaking publicly would cause confusion and hurt the church. When Steve shared this with me, it was suddenly clear that we were no longer in alignment with their process in any way. And in that moment, we became a threat to their efforts to control the narrative. We published the post anyway. We affirmed the courage of the women who came forward with the allegations, and we said we believe them. We asked for honesty and accountability, and then we braced ourselves for the repercussions. And they hit swift and deliberate. So after the post went live, people went off on social media. Most of it was affirming and supportive. I received direct messages from people who shared their own stories of abuse and survival in churches all over. Many of them had never shared with anyone before. I felt so out of my depth. I didn't know how to hold that kind of pain and hold those stories well. It felt overwhelming because I felt so honored and trusted, and it felt overwhelming because I had no idea what I was supposed to do next. And honestly, this is part of what can feel hard about being a pastor's wife is you want to be there for so many people, and you have the privilege of getting to be invited in to some more of the vulnerable and raw parts of a person's story. And while that's such a beautiful thing, we are also just people who for myself, I'm still just a person. I'm a woman, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, and I'm navigating my own grief, my own overwhelm, and walking that path and trying to do it well was exhausting in a way that I had not ever experienced before. Of course, some individuals decided it was their job to reprimand me. Primarily, they did not think I was behaving like a pastor's wife ought to. The calling to account publicly had upset the balance, and I was acting in a way that was causing disruption. How dare I? We had a few close friends who stuck by our side as we confronted the leadership and begged for more honesty and accountability from the elders and staff. We became trauma bonded, kind of like a ragtag band of rebels fighting for our lives. But there were also many who we'd expected to echo our concerns and desire for truth that surprised us and chose to stay silent or even tried to shut us up. Suddenly, we were treated like liabilities or vigilantes, depending on the crowd. I remember one friend calling and screaming at me because I was messing up her plans for how she thought it all should go. She said I was betraying her by stepping out of line, and her tone toward me felt as if she was punishing me for it. I was disinvited to dinners and shunned from friend circles. And like a real life scene from Mean Girls, There were rumors and insults spread about me in numerous circles. Inside, I felt like the ground was ripped out from under me, like no one was safe. Like I was being treated as the person who had done the harm rather than as one of the ones who called it out. Not only that, but so many of our friendships at that time, our lives and our families were intertwined. We would do weekly dinners as families, and suddenly, not only were we losing those connections, but our kids were too. It was devastating to watch their friendships suffer because of this massive thing that was going on that they didn't have really any framework for, and that they didn't really have information for or language for as we were trying to navigate what's appropriate for them to know and what's not. We also noticed that Steve was kept out of more leadership meetings. His position had already shifted from co-lead pastor to lead teaching pastor, as the other co-lead pastor became the lead executive pastor. She was the final decision maker accountable to the elders, even though the congregation still looked to Steve for direction because he was the one up on the weekend stages. Although the former senior pastor was no longer leading the congregation, he wasn't entirely out of the picture. Steve worked so hard to establish boundaries with him, but not everyone did. During that time, we had to reassess what remaining in the role would even entail. The church was conflicted, confused, and there was a lot of work that would need to be done from the top down in order to establish a healthy system and environment. This was work that we both wanted to do. At this point, I was so wrapped up in the beauty of what could happen if the story shifted. And I held on tight, so tight fisted to that hope that there could be something good on the other side if everyone would just dig in and choose to do the right thing. Even though I knew this was going to be hard, we were asking so much. Disruption comes with mess and pain. For some reason, at that point, despite all the evidence to the contrary that I had yet seen, I still believed that together we could build something beautiful with the ashes of the current reality. Steve and the lead executive pastor then had a really difficult conversation in which he shared that their principles were no longer in alignment, and that because of their vastly different approaches to leading through the scandal and fallout, we did not feel integrity in him continuing to lead alongside her. He came home and told me that they'd both agreed to prayerfully consider if they were still truly feeling called to lead the congregation. And when they spoke again, she confirmed that she felt strongly called by God to continue leading there. And he communicated that he would not stand in her way. He would not stage a coup, but that it meant he would be resigning. She and a few elders asked him to wait before making anything official, and he agreed for the sake of the church. And then the article hit. On a Sunday morning, the New York Times published an article detailing the firsthand account of a former assistant to the former senior pastor who had gone on to become the publisher at a major Christian publishing house. In it, she shared multiple experiences of his misconduct and their sexual encounters from decades earlier when she'd worked for him at the church. The article actually included copies of notes and correspondence between them. It was like a bomb went off. After that, our phones were blowing up with texts and calls from people freaking out over the article. Steve and I were stunned. We didn't know what to think. We didn't know what to do. We were frozen. Not only that, but he was scheduled to interview Ira Glass from This American Life at service that morning. Not long after the article dropped, the lead executive pastor called an early meeting ahead of the service. For Steve and I, this felt like the last possible opportunity for the leadership to change course and do the right thing. We both understood that depending on what they did next, we would be making one of the most impactful decisions of our lives. Would we be living with integrity and perhaps walking with the church as it embraced honesty and healing? Or would we be living with our integrity and no paycheck? My stomach dropped at the thought of what it would mean to really, truly not have a paycheck. We didn't have a lot in savings. School was starting up the next few weeks. We hadn't done back to school shopping yet. Would we even be able to do that? How are we going to make it? I couldn't let myself think about it for too long. I had to trust that somehow the leadership was going to shift and do the right thing. And I clung desperately to that hope. Pretending nothing had changed wasn't an option for us. It was, however, exactly what was proposed by the leadership at that morning meeting. The instruction was to go ahead with the service and not acknowledge the article. Steve ran to the bathroom and threw up. At that moment, he realized the leadership was not changing course. They were not going to do the right thing. And that meant he could no longer wait it out. He could no longer cling to hope that things were changing. It meant that he was resigning and we would be maintaining our integrity, but losing our security. He went back and begged the lead executive pastor to change her mind and support the congregation through the wound. However, he was overruled. He told her he was sickened and opposed, yet nothing changed. He knew then that his only option was to resign in protest and to tell the truth publicly in his voice. He came home and together we wrote his resignation letter because this wasn't just him quitting a job. This wasn't just him walking away from his career and his calling and his life's work. This was us saying, we cannot abide by this system that refuses to do the right thing and that chooses to continue to cause harm, not only to the victims who'd come forward, but also what it communicated to every other victim that sat in the pews and listened online that was there now and would be to come. We chose to publish it on his website on purpose, so there was no way for the leadership to warp his words or control the narrative. We needed the world to bear witness in real time. It felt like the most honest option, even though we were terrified. The thing is, we didn't have another job lined up. There weren't other safeguards, and we had no idea how we would make it. But we also knew we couldn't be a part of something willing to ignore the truth and allow harm in exchange for self-preservation. So we used our travel points to get a hotel out of state for the night because we didn't want to be home when the resignation post went live. We knew we'd be targeted by journalists and media outlets, not to mention people from the community who would have questions that we were not ready to answer. 3 days later, the church leadership held another congregational meeting. In it, the lead executive pastor, the same one who had told Steve weeks before that she felt strongly called by God to continue in her role, shared that she had been feeling God calling her to step down for a while. She and the board of elders announced their transition from their roles. I'm proud of the steps that Steve took, the ones that we navigated together, all those late night talks, phone calls, moments spent crying and trying desperately to find a way through that allowed us to maintain integrity and that provided care and love and support for the people who'd been harmed, as well as a path forward for the church and the community. I'm proud that his choices and his courage helped to expose some of the root unhealth and that it induced a subsequent response from leadership. I wish it hadn't taken my husband having to do something that thrust us and our family into such uncharted, scary territory. But I also honestly don't think much would have changed if he'd not done it. Meanwhile, the community was in upheaval. Our collective hearts were broken. Our family lived a few miles from the church campus, and there was no escaping the chaotic fallout in our everyday lives. I couldn't go anywhere without being stopped, questioned, asked to pray, asked to repent, asked to fix and resolve and absolve. I even started to grocery shop in a different town to avoid the whispers and to find some semblance of anonymity as I suddenly felt so exposed. On top of that, my anxiety became impossible to manage, and I barely left the house. The kids struggled to find any semblance of routine, and as a family, it felt like we were drowning. And the thing is, we weren't the first to leave. Other staff had left ahead of us, but we really never heard why. Later, we learned that during the exit interviews, many of them were handed NDAs in exchange for severance or references or other support. While we understand what a complicated and nuanced decision it is, we ourselves could not find peace with signing anything that would silence us or steal our stories. While Steve had been threatened that if he left, he would be leaving with nothing, in the end, and largely due to public pressure, they did provide a few months' severance and even let him keep his laptop. Up until this point, that experience had been devastating, but the months that followed were even worse. We attempted to stay in Illinois and search for another job, but it became impossible to heal while still living in the midst of so much pain and grief and angst. The weight of communal grief, the anger from those who judged us and did not understand the reasons for our decision, and the inability to find support emotionally, spiritually, and financially were too great to overcome by staying where we were. We could no longer afford our home, had no idea where Steve would work next, and needed the support of family near us as we tried to process, heal, and walk our kids through their own grief. We eventually made the difficult decision to move, leaving the Midwest and settling in a rental in Phoenix, Arizona. It's where I'm from and where much of my extended family still lived, and having their support and help was crucial as we tried to pick up the pieces of our lives that remained after leaving the church.
You are about to hear the personal experience of Corinne Shark, wife of Eric, former lead investigator for the Exodus Road, told by her in her own words. TER is a nonprofit whose website states that they are, quote, on the front lines of the fight to end human trafficking. When the Sharks encountered a culture of inappropriate sexual behavior by organization leadership in 2017, they attempted to address it internally. They paid dearly for that act. After 8 years of work to process this experience and find a path for it to do some good, Corinne now takes her step toward reclamation by sharing her story with you here.
It was the final days of 2015. Remember 2015? When everything felt possible and solvable and hopeful? Those were good times. When my husband and I clinked champagne glasses and celebrated our 11th hour victory of reaching the fundraising requirement we'd been working toward that would allow us to move our family to Thailand. We were all in. No plan B. We were convinced nonprofit work in Thailand and upping the ante of our involvement in anti-trafficking work was our next right step, and that any obstacle could be overcome. We were not taking no for an answer from God. Eric was relentless in his fundraising efforts, and I was purging our belongings and packing black and yellow bins with non-negotiables. We had long since moved out of our rental and in with family. We even sold our car. We had pushed every last one of our chips into the center of the table and dared God to match the bet of our faith. Years of Christian industry work had left us beaten up and threadbare. We'd walked down every other road we could think of to stay in some sort of ministry work. Campus ministry, megachurch vocational ministry, Christian higher ed, church volunteerism at multiple churches, parachurch ministries, etc. Every single time we'd see behind the curtain, it would break our hearts and leave us with impossible choices. Every time we'd leave believing there had to be a place we could belong. It had been years since we had first heard about the organization. We started out following their blogger trips, where they hosted well-known writers overseas to expose them to the truths of trafficking. And we started out being donors. We were so eager to give our money every month because we believed in them doing such good work. The international nonprofit sector was our last hope. We'd always wanted to live internationally with our kids. Thailand was never on our radar, but it was the center of the anti-trafficking movement at the time. And so what better way to learn than to go straight to the center of the sector? Well, turns out there are much better and more appropriate ways to learn than to insert yourself into a sector you have no education or experience in, expecting to have a role. All the years of sitting front row in church during sermons filled with saviorism sentiments like, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? Well, it had me raising my hand so fast. Here I am, send me. Years of gathering pre-meme note cards of quotes with platitudes like, God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called, had me believing I could do anything if I was passionate enough and willing enough. Turns out, I would learn there are plenty of educated and qualified professionals who took the time to get equipped. They are already there, they're doing the work, and passion is a false equivalency. Marginalized communities deserve better than bleeding hearts equipped with nothing but good intentions. So when I tell you how we boarded that first flight out of Phoenix, fresh off all our hardest goodbyes, and our son Garrett masked because he had been sick and still had a horrendous cough that was earning dirty looks from everyone around us, you know we were determined. When I tell you how we ran pushing our trolleys stacked high, teetering with bins and suitcases and carry-ons, weaving through the crowds from the domestic terminal to the international terminal at LAX, like we were parting the Red Sea, barely making our connection. And then our daughter, Carson, throws up in the aisle on the plane, trying to get to the bathroom, not 15 minutes into our trans-Pacific flight. You know there was no obstacle we were not overcoming. When I tell you I was on my hands and knees in the aisle, helping the flight attendants clean up my child's vomit, me wiping it off some businessman's nice leather shoes as he scowls down at me on the floor, me casually flinging my lavender essential oils up and down the aisle in hopes of masking the scent, you know there was no turning back. No plan B. This was it. It was all, as my kids now loathe me saying, part of the adventure. Thailand or bust, baby. We were all in. And our first few months of 2016 were magic. Everything was new and exciting. we leaned hard into the honeymoon phase of our new expat life and didn't care how ridiculous we looked. We piled our family of 4 on a single moto. We bought street market pants. We bought coffee at every aesthetic roadside cafe. And we took pictures everywhere. We made all sorts of new friends and had new experiences and loved every minute of it. Until we didn't. Until we started noticing some deeply concerning red flags within the organization we were there to work with. But it wasn't our battle, we'd tell ourselves and each other. Not our battle. The phrase was on repeat in our conversations. We're new here. We're just here to learn. We're just going to stay in our own lane. We're just going to focus on our own work. We've learned this lesson too many times before. It's not our battle. Until they made it our battle. Sexual jokes made by my husband's supervisors became sexual jokes about women in organization leadership, women in the local Thai office, women on work trips, and eventually about me. Graphic descriptions about supervisors engaging in sexual misconduct became descriptions targeting women in the organization's leadership, women in the local Thai office, women on work trips, and eventually me. With every instance, Eric would speak up against his supervisor's behavior, get laughed off, and the severity would increase. The jokes would get more graphic. The sexual scenarios would get more violent. And the fabricated stories, well, they would get more personal. It wasn't our battle until it was. Until the risk of speaking up no longer outweighed the damage being done, the sexually violent culture being perpetuated, and the very real risk of someone getting hurt. Until we decided we would not allow our silence to be complicit in someone else's harm at the hands of the very men who pretended to be protectors. Until we decided we would not stay silent in the face of predators masquerading as heroes. We had moved to Thailand to be a part of a solution. And here we were, face to face with part of the problem. The call was coming from inside the house. It was as if his supervisor enjoyed making him angry. Eric would tell me stories each day after work of the things being said, the actions being simulated, the jokes being made, just to get him riled up, just to see him get upset. There'd be comments made about me, about my Instagram photos. I remember specifically there was one photo of me that I had posted following a trip that I had just taken with a friend, and my mouth was open in a big grin with laughter. It was one of my favorite photos. But when it was spoken about in Eric's office by his supervisors, it was all about how I was asking for it. The jokes were about me, about other women, and what they would like to put in our mouths. If our mouths were going to be open like that, surely we were asking for it. There would be jokes about me having an affair with my neighbor while Eric was away on a work trip. They would laugh as he would get upset, and they would start to talk about what I would be doing with my neighbor the second Eric walked out the door. And then there was the lies about me supposedly sending nude photos to my husband's supervisor, supposedly covered in soap suds in the shower. This was office fodder. I was office fodder. And that's just what was said about me. No woman was safe. No woman was off limits. The comments made about other women, especially Thai women, were increasingly more violent. And every time Eric came home and told me a new story from the office, I grew more and more worried that eventually something was actually going to happen to someone. The worst story was a joke that was being made about putting a bag over a Thai woman's head so that they didn't have to see her face when they sexually assaulted her. In my mind, if a man is willing to joke that violently about what he wants to do to a woman, chances are, at some point, he might actually do it. Eric's stress level at work continued to rise through 2017 as his work conditions continued to deteriorate. I stopped going into the office or being around the team. We both knew the organization's leadership needed to know what was happening, and we both knew it was going to have to be us to tell them. So we began documenting and building a report we would eventually submit to the organization in the fall of 2017. We didn't want it to be our battle. But wasn't this part of the work we signed up for? Intervention, exposing sexual misconduct, being part of a solution instead of letting silence perpetuate the problem. We just didn't know it would be an inside job. We didn't know the report we would file would be the strike of a match that would take us from being an asset to being a liability overnight. That our life would go up in flames because we dared to speak up, to tell the truth. We didn't know doing the right thing was about to cost us everything. Bless our naive little hearts.
Pond 5.
This was not our first rodeo. We were no strangers to disillusionment on the heels of Christian work coming into the nonprofit space, and yet we were fools for hope, absolute suckers for a cause. You'd think we would have seen this coming, but alas, we could not have imagined the backlash that would follow. We genuinely believed that doing the right thing matters, and that if they just had all the information, surely they would want to resolve the situation. If they just knew what was going on, then they could remove those causing harm and protect the good work they had spent so many years building. I mean, if nothing else, they'd want to not be complicit and not be liable. If they just knew, they would, do something. Well, they did. They conducted a brief internal investigation and then immediately terminated Eric's contract, changed the locks on the office doors, told the staff not to talk to us under threat of losing their jobs, and withheld our pay and moving expenses until he agreed to sign an NDA. That's right. We were stuck in country, effectively with no one to hold our work visa, but not enough money to leave, and they knew it. They knew we'd have no choice. Their attorney was threatening us. Our friends and family were scared for our safety. Local staff took the risk and warned us that our house was being watched. We were terrified. Were our kids in danger? Were we? During our last month in Thailand, my mom, Eric's mom, and Eric's oldest sister came to visit as they had been planning for months. We made signs to hold at the airport and brought flower necklaces and bracelets for their arrival. We wanted them to have the full experience, even though our lives were on fire. That night, my mom bought us dinner. I remember it was pizza because our pay was still being withheld and we didn't have enough money in our bank account to cover it. They walked right into the fire with us. And still, we took them to the night market and the grocery store. We took them out to eat at all the quintessential spots and did our best to show them our life, to let our kids just have their grandma, their nana, and their auntie for a week and a half. But they showed up knowing what was going on, and they knew Eric and I were dying inside. I know it took everything my mom had to get back on that plane and return home. She's told me many times since of how scary it was to leave me, knowing what was going on in our world, knowing what was going on with the organization. She wanted to stay. She thought she could protect me somehow. She also just wanted me to get on the plane with her and leave, to run, to escape. I was so busy surviving, I don't even know if I could have seen just how dire the situation was. But we still had a few more weeks. We still had farewells, and we still had details and loose ends to wrap up. Our dear friends had planned a phenomenal farewell party for us. No one says goodbye like missionaries, let me tell you. We showed up that night to our friend's house full of joy and love, sentiment and gifts, food, and every friend we had ever made during our time there. It really was incredible. Not everyone was against us. Not everyone had abandoned us. We teared up walking into that party, seeing that we actually did have support, even if no one in that house knew how high the stakes were for us in that moment. We resolved to enjoy that evening. We were not going to let the organization take that from us too. Our daughter and her friends all huddled on a salah in the yard, a thatched roof, little hut that they had all piled on, and were taking pictures, laughing and crying and telling stories. Our son and all his friends were playing soccer in the field across the street from the house, the one that would get all muddy every rainy season, leaving the boys head to toe covered in dirt and grass and grime. We spent the night laughing and smiling and telling stories and toasting like it was all going to be okay. Like this was all part of the plan. Like we were just returning home like every other expat family eventually does. I remember one of my dearest friends sitting with me on the floor and putting her hand on my shoulder and saying, "You're handling this all so well." She can't see. She can't see what's happening inside me. And it wasn't the time for that. So I let her believe that I was strong. I let her believe that I was handling it all so very well. Eric's former partner was so angry about how we were being treated and told Eric in confidence about some evidence he had on the organization that he would use if he needed. He told Eric about how he wanted to give the CEO the chance to do the right thing. He was ambiguous at best, but we couldn't help but wonder what could be so bad that he would leverage it against the organization in this situation related to us. Well, 2017 gave way to the beginning of 2018, and we just desperately attempted to shield our kids from the fear and flames of our lives burning down around us. We packed up our lives and said our goodbyes and bit our tongues and held our breath long enough to get our boxes into a shipping crate and our bodies onto the first of 4 flights home to the States. We were comatose, shells of ourselves. The fear and trauma and stress and sustained levels of cortisol had taken their toll. We were tombs lifting off the tarmac and into the clouds, fleeing the city we had called home for 2 years. But not just because of the report we filed. Turns out, there was more. "24 hours before we boarded our flight home, Eric's partner showed him the evidence he'd been holding on to. The evidence he had against the organization. Evidence his wife had convinced him that Eric deserved to see. That since it was his last day in country, he'd go ahead and show him. He handed Eric his phone and told him to press play. Eric recognized the setting. It was video taken at a staff retreat they had been at the previous summer. And then Eric recognized himself, unconscious, being sexually assaulted by the very supervisors we had reported, being filmed by the very partner whose phone he held in his hands, the very partner who would then tell him about the baggie of powder he heard the supervisors joking about having for shark at that retreat. The retreat where Eric had always assumed he had food poisoning. The retreat where Eric told me about being so sick he had blacked out. And the next morning, so afraid he'd get left by his team with no cell service and wouldn't make it home. The retreat where Eric walked in the front door of our home afterwards, pale and sweaty and looking like death, talking about how he has never been sick like he was at that retreat. So sick that he was scared. All that time, we had thought the fire burning down our lives and forcing us to leave Thailand was just about the report we had filed. We had no idea the blaze had been lit long before, and that we were already at the center of it. That according to Eric's partner, the CEO had asked him not to show Eric the footage because it could destroy the organization. That 24 hours before we would lift off above those northern hills, his life would be changed forever. They'd hoped we'd leave without ever knowing the truth. And we almost did. So when I tell you how we were so afraid for our safety that we made sure to tell certain friends what we had just learned, just in case we didn't make it home, you know we boarded that first of 4 flights and sat like corpses in our seats. When I tell you how devastated our kids were to leave their friends and the lives they had built, and how they cried the whole way, you know we were protecting them from the full weight of why we had to go home. And when I tell you how I wanted to hide in the bathroom at the Bangkok airport, stay forever in the food court in Seoul, and let the moving sidewalks at Sky Harbor in Phoenix carry me backwards so I didn't have to face not having a house or a car or a job or a life to come home to, so I could just stay suspended between worlds, you know I woke up in the guest bedroom of my parents' house the next morning, the room that was mine as a teenager, and I blinked back, disoriented, tears wishing it was all just a really horrific dream.
But it wasn't a dream. It was our terrifying reality that had me peeking out the front window at my parents' house to be sure we weren't being watched. Because we had been. All the references to our house being watched in Thailand still lived in my body. I was constantly checking my computer and my phone settings to make sure foreign IP addresses weren't accessing our laptop remotely. Because they had. That had already happened. And the fear of that happening again still lived in my body. As terrified as I was, I kept having to remind myself this was my husband's worst nightmare. And it ignited my fight response and the fiercely protective resolve like I had never known. He was always the one fighting for others. He had been the one standing up to the misconduct again and again and again. And finally, he had come to the end of himself. He was exhausted and he was in shock. And I decided it was my turn to fight for him.
In the weeks that followed, I would hover over my keyboard, fingertips quivering, body shaking, poring over every word as I typed out what we had just experienced. The organization's emails followed us home, continuing to remind us to be quiet, insisting Eric must have been drunk, victim blaming him for what had happened to him, reducing the events at the staff retreat to lewd and inappropriate behavior, all the while laying down the first bricks of the narrative they would be building about us, that we were the problem. It became clear that the only card we held was the truth, and the only protection it could offer us is if we laid it on the table and refused to keep their secrets. Calling their bluff and pushing back against their threats felt like our only way to keep from drowning. Staying silent and doing nothing was not an option when we decided to file the initial report, so it sure as hell wasn't going to be after. We had nothing to lose but our pride and nothing to gain but our integrity. So I strung trembling words into sentences and the heaviest sentences into paragraphs, lined up those paragraphs on my social media grid, and I clicked post. Immediately, responses began pouring in: support, shock, I believe yous, and keep going. Friends in Thailand messaged to report how the sector was buzzing with the news and how the damage control campaign from the organization was already gearing up. We expected that. What we didn't see coming was the number of responses that said, not surprised. Not surprised? Wait, so people knew about this issue? Have other things happened? Have other people been harmed? Why are we just now hearing about it? Why has no one done anything or said anything? Well, we know why. We know how it works. We know how it feels to be afraid. We know how it feels to have to weigh the cost. And we know how it feels to lose. The organization response was swift and deliberate. A press release went live positioning the situation as a sad day at the office, that they were victims of a disgruntled former employee, calling me a liar and dismissing me as just the wife. Because, of course, this is how it works. The social media waves rolled on through. So much support and love and care, and so much silence. Crickets, both from men who felt super uncomfortable with the idea that men could be assaulted, to those who were making it clear that in their minds, we should have kept quiet. We should have waited. We should have done it differently. We should have asked permission. But we know how it works. Share too soon and the critics say you're being emotional or reactive. Share too late and the critics wonder why you waited so long, why you're holding on to the past. There's no good time to stand up to a bully. There's no good way to push back against a system designed to preserve itself. The trauma of it all coursing through our veins left us with our head on our pillows at the end of the night, shaking, holding hands, having each other's back, come what may. Soon after, I packed a bag to meet a friend out of town. Eric prepared to fly back to Thailand to file a police report. We didn't know what the path forward would require, but we knew we would need the assault to be documented in country in case we'd ever need the legal record. Eric planned to meet former colleagues, one to help interpret his account at the police station, a friend's apartment to secretly stay at, and a moto to borrow to get around town unnoticed. Meanwhile, I was buried in snow up north at a retreat with a dear friend who knew I desperately needed the escape. It was the middle of the night in a little Airbnb when the messages popped up at my phone screen from an old acquaintance, doubting my story and accusing me of sharing for personal gain. She threw punches I did not see coming. Punches that made it clear we were being spoken about in circles we once thought were safe. That night, I had my first panic attack. I spiraled alone in the dark until dawn, and I spent the rest of the trip just trying to get home. The connection of those who had gone silent and those going for my jugular blindsided me. The felt betrayal within relationship was more devastating than any threat of legal action ever could be. Years later, the text message came in from a friend in another hemisphere with another story, and that led to another story and another and another. More was happening within the same organization. People were ready to share, some by name, some anonymously, all pointing to the same patterns, the same abuses of power, and the same silencing tactics. We were not the only ones. Over many, many months, I worked on co-authoring an open letter representing a group of people who had been harmed by the organization and wanted to take action by sharing their stories and shining light on what had been kept in shadow. The letter went live. Another press release would call us liars and dismiss us as simply being out to destroy their good work. The open letter ended up connecting us to journalist Matt Carroll, who was interested in what was going on within the anti-trafficking sector and set out to collect hours of interviews toward his series of investigative articles. His Pulitzer-winning work on the Spotlight team that broke a story of child sex abuse within the Catholic Church helped us all feel like our stories were in such safe and capable hands. He was no stranger to threats and attempts to silence, so his care toward each person interviewed was absolutely life-giving. The articles published, and while the waves may have seemed small, they felt seismic to everyone involved. It is no small thing to make someone feel seen and heard. Action had been taken on behalf of my family, on behalf of others harmed, and on behalf of the larger sector doing good work. There was rest in that, healing in that. And that's when the creative winds picked up. That's when the desire to make something beautiful out of the healing started to swirl. That's when Sarah and I started asking ourselves, and eventually each other, what there might be for us to make together. I mean, what are the chances the two of us would go through the hardest seasons of our lives at the same time, and that we'd have been uniquely able to walk each other through the darkest nights? Lighting our candles, texting our with yous, and then what are the chances we'd both end up with nowhere to go but back to the desert, where we'd walk her healing trails until our wounds became scars and our scars became tattoos? What are the chances we'd find our way to this bonfire here and now with you? So much happened, and so much has happened since, and this is where we're going to talk about it.
If you made it to the end and are still with us, we know that was a lot to hold, but we also know we don't hold it alone. Meet us back here for episode 2.
And bring your matches.
You've been listening to Spiritual Pyro with Sarah Carter and Corinne Shark on the 1C Story Network. For more about this and all of our shows and books, please visit just1c.com. That's JUSTONEC.com.
The 1C Story Network, for the love of stories.